Welcome to A Drop of Silence, the groundbreaking podcast series that dives deep into the realms of controversy. Join us as we bring special guests who share their extraordinary experiences and offer unparalleled insight into history, today's news headlines, and the future. Get ready to embark on a thought-provoking journey where silence speaks volumes and the truth lies somewhere beneath the surface.
What time will it be when war is no more? When bullets are melted and the warships moor.
Shalom, everyone. My guest this week is Yoram Ettinger. I have known Yoram for several years. I used to have him on my Jewish radio show, Boker Tov, back at CJAM at the university radio station. I had him on a lot because he just made so much sense and a lot of things were confusing. He just could easily put it into perspective. One of the things that I especially appreciated, because I'm rather blunt myself, is how blunt he is. He's just like, no, you're wrong. Let me explain it to you so you understand, but you're wrong. Okay. So I hope you enjoy this interview that I do with Yoram. And he has promised to come back on this podcast series several times. Retired Ambassador Yoram Ettinger is an insider on U.S. relations. He served as Minister for Congressional Affairs at Israel's Embassy in Washington with a rank of an ambassador, Israel's Consul General in Houston, and Director of Israel's Government Press Office. He is a consultant to members of Israel's cabinet and Knesset and regularly briefs U.S. legislators and their staff on Israel's contribution to vital U.S. interests. Ambassador Ettinger's op-eds have been published in Israel and in the U.S., and he has been interviewed on Israel and U.S. TV and radio many, many times. He was a speaker at AIPAC Annual Conference. He is the editor of Straight from the Jerusalem Cloakroom and Boardroom newsletters on issues of national security and overseas investments. You can hear him at the Ettinger Report newscast on YouTube. Welcome, Yoram, to A Drop of Silence. I want to go back to Jimmy Carter, his time, because everybody says what a wonderful man he was, how wonderful he was to Israel. He brought the peace between Egypt and Israel. But then about a year later, he came out with a book that was so anti-Israel and so anti-Semitic, I knocked my socks off. And then 10 years later, he recanted and said, I shouldn't have written that book because that isn't what happened and that isn't what I believed. Did you happen to hear about any of that?
No.
No? Okay. So they swept it. They just swept that whole thing. But I have a copy of that book. I was just shocked. So can we talk about the Iranian situation?
Sure.
How they I was stunned when they offered to give Iran all those millions and millions of dollars so that they wouldn't create a nuclear bomb. And friends of mine who are in the Canadian Armed Forces says, well, no, Iran has had a nuclear bomb since 2010 or something. And it's in the Zagros Mountains, mountain area. What is your take on what the U.S. did by giving Iran all that money?
Well, shooting himself in the foot. A more self-destructive U.S. policy, which has been going on for the last 43 years, bolstering Iran's anti-U.S. Islamic terrorism, anti-U.S. Drug trafficking, anti-U.S. proliferation of ballistic technologies, and not only in the Persian Gulf or in the Middle East, all the way to Latin America. Iran is increasingly entrenched in South and Central America, all the way to the U.S.-Mexico border, cooperating with the drug cartels, cooperating with terror organizations, cooperating with every single anti-American government, whether it's Venezuela or Cuba or Ecuador or Bolivia, most recently Chile and Colombia, Brazil now. There's hardly a pro-U.S. government left in Latin America, but each one of those anti-U.S. governments or regimes have developed very close ties with Iran's ayatollahs, including terror training camps conducted by the ayatollahs, along with Hezbollah terrorists, by the way, mostly in the tri-border areas of Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, and then Chile and Peru and Bolivia. Those tri-border areas are basically lawless areas, heaven for terrorists, drug traffickers, arms traffickers, human traffickers, money laundering, and the Iranians are enmeshed in each one of those rogue activities. They have in Venezuela, they have a base where they test ballistic technologies. They have exported Predator unmanned aerial vehicles, their own developed manufactured Predator unmanned aerial vehicles to the drug cartels, to Venezuela, to Cuba. They have exported to the drug cartels machinery designed to construct underground tunnels under the U.S.-Mexico border. They view Latin America as the soft underbelly of the U.S., and the reason they have invested so many resources since the early 1980s, they didn't start yesterday, has been going on for over 40 years. The reason is they consider the U.S. their number one target. The number one target has never been Israel. The number one target has been the what they call the Great American Satan. And their entrenchment in Latin America aims to bring that Great American Satan to submission. Now, it may sound completely illogical to most Western persons, but the Ayatollahs take it very seriously. And we have to realize they don't think like Westerners. They base their conduct on a very fanatic religious ideology, which has its roots in the 7th century. They educate their children to advance that vision. And it's not only limited to the U.S. First and foremost, they aim to bring down every single what they call apostate regime. Apostates are the Sunni Muslims. The Ayatollahs are Shiites. Any non-Shiite Muslim is an apostate. And they want to bring down every single apostate regime, namely all pro-Western Arab regimes in the Persian Gulf and throughout the Middle East, and then to bring the so-called infidel West to submission, headed by the great American Satan. And in 2015, when they received roughly $150 billion, part of the JCPOA, the nuclear accord, contrary to the very, very naive, superficial, Pollyannish state of mind of the State Department architects of that agreement, they did not direct those $150 billion to enhance standard of living in Iran. It was directed to bolster their terror machinery, war machinery, drug trafficking machinery, and proliferation of ballistic technology machinery. And they have become a major epicenter of global anti-American operation, which is, by the way, very natural for rogue regimes, because rogue regimes always bite the hand that feeds them. Yeah. The West thinks, deludes itself, that feeding the rogue regime would mellow the rogue regime. It doesn't mellow it. It only whets its appetite.
Okay, now here's my question. I mean, I am a religious follower of the Ettinger Report. I read you all the time. I always have for as long as you've done this. And none of that, what you have just said, which is so obvious to me, and all I did was a little research and, looked up what our Canadian Army says as opposed to what the government says, which are two different entities here. Why does Western media not pick up on this? Why do they not question it as any sane person should?
Well, Western media, just like many, maybe too many intelligent elements in the Western world, assumes that most of the world appreciates Western values, Western human rights, Western democracy, Western peaceful coexistence. They do not want to believe, they do not tolerate the idea that the vast majority of the world, certainly in the Middle East, do not want to digest this Western norms, this Western institutions or values. Many Westerners, and I admit also too many Israelis, are addicted to the pursuit of peace. Now, pursuing peace is a sublime venture, but it must be based on reality. When you base the pursuit of peace on superficial view of reality, alternative reality, Pollyannish visions, oversimplifies the reality, then it becomes self-destructive, leveraged by the enemies of peace, by the enemies of democracy. And when it comes to Western media, by and large, or the so-called elite Western media, they have been wrong and wronger and wrongest on major issues of the Middle East. You go back to 1978-79, the end of the era of the Shah of Iran, the beginning of the era of Ayatollah Khomeini, and then thereafter the Ayatollah's regime in Iran, a very robust tailwind to the Ayatollah's takeover of Iran was provided by the Western intelligentsia led by the U.S. State Department, which was the architect of the pro-Ayatollah Khomeini policy implemented by President Jimmy Carter. And that policy was based on the notion that Ayatollah Khomeini will be preoccupied once he takes over Iran with domestic issues. Ayatollah Khomeini wants to bring in Islamic revolution to Iran, but not outside of Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini, according to that very superficial view, was obviously anti-communist and therefore anti-Russian, and therefore supposedly amenable to alliance with the U.S., with the Western world. In fact, the CIA and the State Department went as far as ensuring or telegraphing from Tehran to Washington their assessment that Ayatollah Khomeini was then expected to become an Iranian edition of Gandhi. They went that far. President Jimmy Carter, inspired by the State Department, briefed global leaders about 10 days before the February 1st takeover of Iran by Ayatollah Khomeini. And he briefed global leaders in the island of Guadeloupe, and he assured them that Ayatollah Khomeini is going to be preoccupied with tractors, not with tanks. And obviously it didn't take much time before Ayatollah Khomeini started to bite the hand that fed him, namely the USA. First of all, took over the American embassy in Tehran, held some 50 Americans hostage for about 444 days, and evolved as the number one enemy of the US in the Gulf, in the Middle East, in Latin America, in West Africa, in North Africa, in most of the world. And sadly, the US State Department, the US elite media, and to an extent the US elite academia, they have not changed their worldview on Iran. They still subscribe to the diplomatic option as the way to deal with Iran and make sure that Iran does not become a nuclear power. And my claim is that addiction is a very, very strong disease. And if you don't take care of that disease, it consumes your sense of realism. It happens to conventional drugs, even to most intelligent folks who are addicted to drugs. And in a way, the addiction to superficial, to wishful thinking piece is a certain type of drug. And the fact is that since 1979, the last 44 years by now, we're talking about a very, very self-destructive U.S. policy with no sign of rethinking that policy by the U.S. State Department. You saw the same thing with Saddam Hussein. Irrespective of Saddam's conduct on the home front, irrespective of Saddam's involvement in terrorism, he was perceived to be the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And it did occur to the State Department that the enemy of my enemy could be also my enemy. And that very superficial attitude prevailed until literally the day of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990. In fact, about a week before the invasion, the U.S. ambassador to Baghdad, April Gillespie, she met with Saddam Hussein, and Saddam posed a very direct question. what should I expect U.S. reaction to be if I decide to invade Province 19, that's the Iraqi name for Kuwait, in order to bring it back to the Iraqi motherland? And the response by the U.S. ambassador to Baghdad, as reflective of the worldview of then Secretary of State Jim Baker and the White House, was, it's none of our business. It's an inter-Arab issue. Now, there couldn't be a greener light for invasion of Kuwait, and I can only imagine the very bewildered eyes of Saddam when he heard that President Bush is planning a military offensive against him after issuing such a very, very bright and clear green light. The same thing took place in Libya. In Libya, the State Department and the White House orchestrated a NATO military offensive against Gaddafi, offensive led by the USA, because Gaddafi violated human rights the way he literally butchered his opposition. It escaped their mind that the opposition were Islamic terrorists, and that Gaddafi, who was an Islamic terrorist until 2002, 2003, was transformed into a major and possibly the major warrior in Africa against anti-Western Islamic terrorism. It didn't occur to them that Gaddafi transferred his nuclear infrastructure, biochemical warfare infrastructure to the US to prove his transformation into a constructive leader. An offensive took place to supposedly free the Libyan people of the ferocious, outrageously behaving Gaddafi. Gaddafi, as we all know, not only was he defeated, he was lynched by Muslim terrorists inside Libya. And since 2011, when all that took place until today, Libya, which was controlled by Gaddafi to the benefit of Western war on Islamic terrorism, that Libya has become a lawless, uncontrollable, chaotic state, heaven for Islamic terrorism, and one of the major global platforms for Islamic terrorism, anti-US, anti-Europe, anti-Western Islamic terrorism. The same thing took place with Obama and the State Department courting the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, 2010, 2011, turning their back on Mubarak, who was pro-American, courting the anti-Western Muslim Brotherhood, which until today is in fact the largest Sunni Muslim terrorist group in the entire world, operating in the Middle East, in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Africa. And the US turned against Mubarak, facilitating the rise to power of the Muslim Brotherhood. And it took an action by the Egyptian military to free Egypt of the control by the Muslim Brotherhood. It took the State Department a number of years to recover from that and adjust itself to the merit of Sisi, Egyptian military control over Muslim control. And the same thing, by the way, characterized State Department and White House attitude towards Yasser Arafat, the arch-terrorist, and the PLO, Palestinian Terrorist Organization. Before Oslo, In fact, since 1988, when the US for the first time, December 88, recognized the PLO, again deluding itself that the PLO simply wants an independent state by Israel's side. It didn't occur to them that the PLO was guided by the vision to not to constrain Israel to a smaller size, but to uproot what they call the Zionist entity in the so-called abode of Islam. And certainly the State Department has viewed the Palestinian issue as the crux of the Arab-Israeli conflict, as the crown jewel of Arab policy making, as a core cause of Middle East turbulence, none of which has anything to do with reality. One can talk hours about that, but just for example, no Arab country ever flexed a military muscle on behalf of the Palestinians. Not a single Arab-Israeli war was launched on behalf of Palestinians or because of Palestinians. But more than that, Arab countries never flexed the muscles during Israel-Palestinian wars. The first Intifada, the second Intifada, Israel's war against the PLO in Lebanon, the 4 or 5 wars we fought against Palestinians in Gaza. In none of those wars was there any Arab military involvement. There has been, I would call it, minimal lip service diplomatic involvement. There has been less than lip service financial involvement on behalf of the Palestinians. Just to give you an example, back in the 1980s, Saudi Arabia was the #1 funder of the Mujahideen war in Afghanistan against Soviet military presence in Afghanistan. They provided the Mujahideen $1 billion every single year during the 1980s. At the same time, they provided the PLO $100 million. I don't take lightly $100 million, but it's 10% of what they accorded the Mujahideen, for anyone to assess how important or how marginal is the Palestinian issue on the Saudis' order of priority. In recent years, the Saudis stopped altogether financial support of the Palestinian Authority. And the question is, how come? How come the Arab world floods the Palestinians with embracing talk, but at the same time, the walk is anywhere from indifferent to negative? Why are the Arabs behaving like that? How come Palestinian leaders who frequent Canada, USA, Western Europe, or even Israel are usually received in a red carpet treatment manner? But when the same Palestinian leaders come to Saudi Arabia, to United Arab Emirates, to Egypt or Jordan, they are received in a shabby doormat fashion. Why are the Arabs treating the Palestinians that way? And the answer, once again, is the difference. The Arabs are aware of the reality of the Palestinians, or to be specific, the Palestinian track record in the intra-Arab context, which has been a very rogue track record. According to the Palestinians, the name of, or the position of, role model of intra-Arab subversion, terrorism, treachery, and ingratitude. But at the same time, the Western world is not very interested in past track record. The Western world is much more interested in future prospects for peace. And since the past is so frustrating and so inconvenient and so bloody, why should we involve ourselves with such a hopeless track record? Isn't it much better to assume that we're dealing with very, very encouraging scenario in the future? The fact that that scenario is absolutely detached from reality does not ring a bell in the minds of Western architects of foreign policy or national security policy. Hence, the difference between the Western attitude towards the Palestinians and the Arab attitude towards the Palestinians. And if I would take the current reality of the possible Saudi-Israeli accord, maybe normalization, maybe full peace. In my mind, the current key hurdles on the road for such an accord is the State Department in Washington, because the State Department persists in the diplomatic option towards Iran, which means it allows Iran to gradually become a nuclear power, and therefore it's the State Department that is pushing the Saudis closer to Chinese arms, closer to Russian arms, and it's a State Department policy which makes the Saudis determined to achieve nuclear power, because they know the reality in the Middle East, and they know that the State Department is unintentionally, but the State Department is in fact providing tailwind to the nuclearization of Iran. And the second hurdle, which is posed by the State Department, is the Palestinian issue. The Saudis do not regard the Palestinian issue as a top priority. The Saudis are driven by Saudi, not by Palestinian interest. The Saudis are aware that the Palestinian state, if established, will not be different than the past track record of the Palestinians so far, namely rogue track record. Rogue track record in the Middle East adds fuel to the fire, threatening the regimes in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, in Egypt, in the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. And therefore, the Saudi Crown Prince, who was recently interviewed on Fox, he did not mention even once Palestinian state. He did not mention once freezing Jewish construction in the West Bank. He did not mention even once Israeli facilitation of a two-state solution, because he knows very well a Palestinian state would not serve his interest. And the State Department's insistence on progress towards two-state solution is at this particular state of the negotiation a major hurdle.
Okay, this is in my mind, I'm watching Saudi Arabia, Israel, all of these people. You're very intelligent, and you see something for what it is. And in my mind, having dealt with a lot of simple, good people in the United States and Canada, especially in government, it seems the more higher up in government they are, the simpler their thought process is. I remember back before World War II started, somebody said, good people cannot recognize evil when they see it, especially, and this is especially true for Iran. I think the Ayatollah is evil. And could it be as simple as they don't recognize evil for what it is?
It's not evil. It's political culture or governance culture. The political culture in the Middle East for the last 14 centuries, since the 7th century, has been characterized by unpredictability, by shifty reality, by intolerance, violence. I'm talking about intra-Muslim, intra-Arab relations, not relations toward the so-called infidel Jew or infidel Christian. We're talking about an area where peaceful coexistence among Muslims, among Arabs, hasn't been a major phenomena. We're talking about a region when there is no yet single Arab democracy. Leaders in the Arab world do not rise to power through the ballot. They rise to power through the so-called bullet, through violence. And one day they're going to lose power through bullet, not through violence, which means we're talking about tenuous regimes. Tenuous may mean few months, tenuous may mean few years, tenuous may mean few decades, tenuous may mean 100 or 200 years, but by definition, and based on the track record of the last 1400 years, we're talking about a tenuous regime. We had in Iran a very, very radical regime until 1952 or 53. Then came the Shah of Iran, who evolved into the American policeman of the Gulf. And then came Ayatollah Khomeini, who became America's #1 enemy. We had in Libya King Idris of Libya, who was pro-Western, and then came Gaddafi and toppled the king, and then came the US-led NATO military offensive and toppled Gaddafi, and then it was succeeded by a series of civil wars which still go on inside Libya. We have seen Iraq being a monarchy, and then through series of military regimes, radical regimes. We saw Egypt under monarchy, and then Egypt under the military regime of Nasser, and then Sadat, and then Mubarak, and then Egypt under the Muslim Brotherhood, which turned Egypt around completely, and then back to a military regime of Sisi. Yemen has gone through countless civil wars, which are tearing apart the country as we speak. Lebanon has gone through too many civil wars. Syria is going through a major civil war since 2011, 2012. And I mention that because when you conclude peace accord in the Middle East, this is not a peace accord concluded in West Europe or in North America. It's a peace accord concluded with a tenuous regime. And one must realize that that accord is going to last as long as the regime will last. That means that peace accords in the Middle East must not be considered a major component of national security. The mountain ridges of Judea and Samaria, of the West Bank, are a fixed component of national security. Their height, their topography is now and will remain as such for many, many years, maybe for eternity. But peace accord with Egypt or with Jordan or with the UAE or with Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or Morocco depends on the tenuous regime that signs it. Now, I know that this is not a very comforting realization, but we have to decide. Do we want to conduct our national security based on reality, or are we determined, for the sake of good feeling, to sacrifice reality, frustrating reality, bloody reality, on the altar of very comforting, optimistic, so to speak, Pollyannish wishful thinking. Israel cannot afford to go through such a Pollyannish exercise. For Israel to give up the control of the mountain regions of Judea, Samaria, which happened, by the way, to be the cradle of Jewish religion and history and culture and yearnings and language, but at the same time, an irreplaceable and the most critical component of national security, controlling some 80% of the population of Israel, controlling the pre-67 Israel, which is a sliver of 8 to 15 mile wide. For Israel to give up that piece of real estate would be tantamount to suicidal action. Many years ago, we had a foreign minister, some say legendary foreign minister, Mr. Abba Eban. Abba Eban, during those days, right after independence of 1948, was one of the leading Davish leaders in Israel. But that Davish leader of Israel referred to the pre-67 lines of Israel as the lines of Auschwitz, because being Davish did not make him ignorant of Middle East reality. Sadly, today, we see too many intelligent people, well-meaning people in the West who sacrifice the Palestinian track record, who sacrifice Middle East reality on the altar of wishful thinking, and therefore pressuring Israel to commit itself to concessions which would be tantamount to suicide.
Okay, I have one more question, and then I'm going to let you go for today. I could listen to you talk forever. I'm addicted to you, so you've got a fan here. How did the Ettinger Report begin? And if people are interested and they want to read the Ettinger Report, how do they go about doing it?
Well, I was head of a Middle East research unit in the Israeli civil service, and then I served a number of diplomatic positions in the U.S. And when I completed my government service at the end of 1992, I decided to persist in enhancing education of key target audiences in the US, Canada, and some parts of Western Europe through what I call education, namely sharing with those target audiences my own assessment, my own experience in the Middle East. And I've been doing it since 1993. Most of the target audience, by the way, does not agree with me. I do not preach to the choir. I preach, so to speak, to multipliers, to policymakers, public opinion molders, Jews, non-Jews, conservatives, liberal, Republicans, Democrats, academia, church leaders, etc. And I do it through weekly articles, periodical brief videos. I have my website, which is The Ettinger Report in one word.com, Ettinger with double T. And my email, by the way, is yoramtex, YORAMTEX @gmail.com. And anyone who wants to share with me criticism of my articles, criticism of this conversation, or any other feedback is welcome to communicate with me directly via this email, yoramtex@gmail.com.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for coming on A Drop of Silence podcast. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and it's a great honor. I've always had a lot of respect for you, and I hope you'll come on again.
Thank you very much, because it's not only my pleasure, it's my honor. And please let me know anytime you want me on. I'm going to be there.
Thank you. Thank you.
What time will it be when war is no more? When bullets are melted and the warships moor.
This podcast is brought to you by Unbreakable Bindings Publishing Company. Executive produced by Lori Baldassi, produced by Ryan Richardson, hosted by Pam Goldstein.